In this course, we've looked at not only what the climate crisis is, but what each of us can do about it. These include personal action, collective activism, political action, communication, and so forth. We've also noted that these are often deeply interconnected. Today, I would like to bring all these together into a list of 20 things that each of us can do about the climate crisis. Actually, it's two lists of 10, with the first focusing on individual action, the second political and collective actions. This lecture is intended as something of a capstone for the course. Hence, it is in part a recap, especially as I quote myself in places. Still, I think that it will be useful to bring all this together. Hence, if you recommend just one video from the course to a friend, this may well be the best one. Incidentally, if you find this recap a little redundant, that's great, as it means you've been paying attention. However, do watch it through, as there's quite a bit of new material here. Moreover, if you are taking the UCSB course, it is also intended as something of a review for the final exam. As I noted in the segment on Cowspiracy, author Jonathan Safran Foer recently published a book entitled We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast, where he argued that each of us should adopt a plant-based diet if we want to save the planet from catastrophic climate change. Hence, saving the planet begins when we eat, at breakfast and otherwise. It would be great if saving the planet were that easy. However, as we have seen, unfortunately, it's not. In fact, as I have noted, the fracking industry alone is responsible for more methane emissions than the beef industry, and CO2 is a far greater source of emissions than methane. So don't get me wrong, we can certainly help the planet at the breakfast table. In fact, I list two ways that we can do so on the first list below. But we cannot stop there, as it simply will not be enough. Not nearly enough. Moreover, we need to be clear about something. Regardless of what we do, the planet will obviously continue on. Hence, the phrase saving the planet almost always implies that we are saving it for ourselves, humanity. As humans are just one of many species of beings that inhabit the earth, a more equitable, less anthropogenic way of stating what the phrase leaves unsaid is saving the planet for all life on it. Still, I think that Foer is on to something, as what he proposes is certainly what I would call humanity's approach, as he focuses on anthropogenic, and by that I mean human-caused climate change as a result of human action. Nonetheless, we need to act at more than just the breakfast table. Here are 10 examples of what we can do that are in this vein. Saving the planet begins, 1, at markets and restaurants, when we buy enough to eat and no more. Food waste is a huge problem, as we've seen in the U.S. and globally. As Peter Kalmus succinctly observed, about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to food productions, and about 1/2 of this, that's 15% of global emissions, are due to livestock, mainly cows. And, as Project Drawdown noted, we can draw down more greenhouse gas emissions by addressing food waste than by switching to largely plant-based diets. However, while being vegan may have more impact than being vegan, the ideal personal solution is to largely eat a plant-based diet and waste as little food as possible. This includes eating food that we would otherwise discard, such as the leafy tops of beets and other vegetables. Saving the planet begins, too, at meals, when we eat for the good of the planet and its climate. Although the word has not yet entered the popular imagination in a big way, perhaps the best way to eat is to eat as a climatarian, someone who eats for the good of the planet and its climate. Certainly being vegan or freegan is good, but being a combination of the two is great. And being a climatarian means more than looking carefully at the vegetables. It means more than just looking at the vegetables that we eat. As we have seen, eating asparagus in the winter in most of North America is often no better for the climate than eating chicken or pork, as it is generally flown in from South America. And of course, air travel has a huge climate footprint. Incidentally, as Project Drawdown noted, the number one thing that we can do to roll back greenhouse gas emissions does not involve wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, or any sort of similar technologies. Instead, greater gains would come from the change in the way that we eat. When combined, wasting less food and switching to a largely plant-based diet would result in a staggering reduction of 137 gigatons of CO2 or equivalent gases every year. In comparison to this reduction, globally shifting from fossil fuels to electricity generated by photovoltaic, that's solar cells, would roll back less than half this amount of emissions. The adoption of electric vehicles, far less than 10%. We should, of course, work on exploring a variety of technologies to help reduce our emissions, but it's important to keep their relative impact in perspective. Saving the planet begins 3, in the bedroom, when we use contraceptive and limit family size. Globally, there are 85 million unintended pregnancies every year. 32 million of these, that's 38%, result in births. In the U.S., nearly half, 45% of all pregnancies are unintended. Hence, having both access to effective birth control and actually using it is of central importance. This is both a deeply personal issue as well as a public one, as access to birth control is restricted across the planet for religious and other reasons. In Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, 97% of women do not have unrestricted access to abortion as an option of last resort. Saving the planet also begins, number 4, in the classroom, when we fairly and equally educate boys and girls. We need to educate more girls and women, which dramatically curbs population growth, as the more education a woman has, the fewer children she has. Together with family planning, this would roll back 103 gigatons of CO2 or equivalent emissions, more than any other change other than changing the way that we eat, which is that above-mentioned synergy of wasting less food and switching to largely plant-based diets. This is not to say that we should place responsibility for this particular issue with girls and women. To the contrary, the responsibility lies with the institutions that restrict a woman's access to education and control of her own body, and 2, it's obviously the case that contraceptive is a male issue as well. What I find so interesting about this approach to curbing greenhouse gas emissions is that it is a win-win-win. First, rolling back 103 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions could have real, significant, big impact on the climate crisis. Second, educating women and girls across the planet is also terrific in its own right. Even without the environmental gains, we should obviously make every effort to do this. And third, as far as I am concerned, and I'm part speaking here as the father of a daughter, every woman on the planet should have control, including reproductive control, of her own body. Saving the planet begins 5, on the way to work, when we walk, bike, or use public transportation or something similar, rather than owning a car. For the average American, 25% of our climate footprint comes from owning a car, as a typical car in the U.S. emits 4.6 metric tons of CO2 or equivalent gases per year. However, the carbon released in making a car is also a huge problem. As noted in the lecture on electric cars, if you buy a succession of cars during your adult life, one every 11 years, and leave them in your driveway and never drive them, you will have totally expended your CO2 allotment for your lifetime, whether this car is gas, electric, diesel, hybrid, whatever. And of course, this does not leave any other emission allotment for anything else, such as food, clothing, housing, and everything else that we need to live, including actually driving that car. Saving the planet begins at home, when we choose to live in appropriately sized dwellings or co-housing, instead of an average, i.e. oversized American house, let alone a McMansion. The largest chunk of the average American's climate footprint, about a third of it, in fact, comes from our houses, from heating and cooling them, as well as energy use, such as lighting and appliances. So what then is to be done? It's simple enough. Move to a micro apartment or certain housing, like co-housing, that is more efficient, as this can greatly reduce your climate footprint. For the average American, over half of our climate footprints thus comes from the above 2 sources: cars, which accounts for roughly 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and our houses, which account for almost a third. However, as we have seen, the good news for transportation and housing, when taken together, is there's a simple way to approach both. Move to a city. City living can mean dramatically less car use. In Manhattan, only 1 in 5 people commute to work by car, and generally smaller, more efficient housing. Saving the planet begins on vacation and when traveling, when we choose slow travel over air travel, which is environmentally the worst way to get around. True, air travel only accounts for 2 or 2.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. However, somewhat paradoxically, air travel can literally double the size of the climate footprint for many Americans. The problem is that traveling by air is a practice exclusive to the wealthiest, most privileged people, as 19 out of 20 people on the planet have never set foot in an airplane. Even among Americans, half do not fly annually. But by some estimates, 80% of all flights flights are done by just 1% of all people on the planet. You may not think of yourself as a global elite or a member of the jet set, but if you fly, you are. If you are a frequent flyer, put 100 random people in a room and you will be contributing more to the climate crisis in this way than anyone else in the room. You may not think of yourself as a member of the 1%, i.e. the world's wealthiest, the most privileged people, but you would be among the 1% doing the lion's share of all this flying. Saving the planet begins 8 in stores and online when we choose not to buy yet more unnecessary stuff. In one sense, minimalism is hardly new, as most human beings throughout human history have probably gotten by with the bare minimum or nearly so, as needed for life. Even today, for a broad swath of people across the planet, this is likely still true. But what we are talking about here is voluntary minimalism. Relatively wealthy people who could buy lots of stuff but choose not to for environmental or for other reasons. In this sense, minimalism could be called a first world solution to a first world problem. However, since the developing world is far and away the largest contributor to the climate crisis, this is nonetheless an important intervention. Many people believe that responding to the climate crisis on a personal level will mean that we have to do with quite a bit less, which means that we will have to live lives of, drab deprivation. What's so interesting about minimalism is that this group of individuals voluntarily has decided to do without quite a bit because they believe that this is a much better way to live. And this was, incidentally, also Henry David Thoreau's message. Saving the planet begins 9, offline, when we borrow, rent, or otherwise exchange, as well as repair things rather than buying still more stuff. In the documentaries Being the Change, Live Well and Spark a Climate Revolution, and Tomorrow, that's Damien, the French film, we met a number of people, including climate scientist Peter Kalmus and his family, as they attempt to live sustainable lives. I also put 2 short videos on the syllabus with a similar theme, and that's visualizing a plenitude economy and the high price of materialism. In different ways, each of these films draw attention to people who, working together by bartering, borrowing, renting, and repairing things, significantly reduced their relentless acquisition of stuff. Finally, for this list, Saving the Planet begins 10 with buying. Not only by buying less, sharing, and keeping things longer, but also by buying from companies with environmentally sound and socially just practices. The documentary The True Cost, as well as the episode of the Patriot Act on the ugly truth of fast fashion, expose the horrible consequences of free rather than fair trade. This not only impacts the planet and its climate, but people all over the globe directly. Social justice, environmental justice, and climate justice are all not only related, but deeply and inexorably intertwined. Hence, when buying, you have the opportunity to, quote, vote with your dollar, to support fair trade products that were made under decent working conditions and the manufacture of which did not harm, as much as possible, the environment and the climate. Incidentally, when taken together, these last 3 things that we can do regarding stuff can have profound consequences for each of us in the developed world, as 1/4 of the average American's climate footprint comes from all the stuff that we buy. So this list of 10 things is by no means complete, but hopefully you get the idea. Note that all of the above involve personal and cultural changes rather than new or more technology. Similar, but on a somewhat different note, saving the planet can also begin in the following 10 ways. So, saving the planet begins, number 11, at the polling place, when we cast our vote for candidates from local to federal, advocating for sweeping climate policies such as carbon pricing and the Green New Deal. Personal climate action, while important and indeed essential, is simply not enough. For example, the example we've used a number of times now, around 28% of methane emissions comes from meat, generally beef. However, an even greater amount comes from fossil fuel extraction, principally from hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking. Consequently, just switching to a largely plant-based diet does not address the largest methane problem that we are facing. This problem, fracking, cannot be, practically speaking, handled through personal action. How then do we stop fracking? It's simple enough. We need to vote and become politically active, calling for legislation to end it. As I never tire of telling my students, if you can do only one thing to help mitigate the climate crisis and you do not have a lot of time to devote to the issue, well, you're in luck. That's the single most important thing that you can do. It takes just an hour or two per year, and that's voting. And who doesn't have an hour or two per year to help save the planet? Saving the planet begins 12. Again at the polling place, when we vote for candidates and initiatives to put people and the planet ahead of corporate interest. Not only should we cast our vote for candidates advocating for sweeping climate policies, such again as carbon pricing and the Green New Deal, but we need to think more broadly, as there are a range of other problems and industries and injustices in the world, both environmental and social, that need our attention. For example, the beef industry not only contributes to the climate crisis through the release of methane, but causes a range of other environmental problems, such as habitat loss. 40% of all the land in the U.S. is used to feed livestock animals, and also the use of many trillions of gallons of water per year. And then there's the question of waste removal, pathogen runoff, and a range of issues relating to herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, and so forth. We need to vote for the environmental initiatives that address issues like this. Similarly, as the film The True Cost revealed, there are important and heartbreaking social justice issues across the planet, including the U.S., that need to be addressed, and this can only happen through political action. We can start to save the planet. Number 13. Prior to the polling places, as we can explain to 5 or more of our friends and family the importance of voting on behalf of the planet, its climate, and all the life that lives on it. As we have seen, communication is of central importance, not only in communicating the problem to the people who are not yet convinced of the importance, let alone the urgency of the climate crisis, but friends who may be aware of the problem, but are not significantly acting in response to it. Because voting can have far more impact than any action that you can take personally on the climate crisis, such as switching to a largely plant-based diet. Explaining the importance of voting on behalf of our planet and all its life to 5 or more friends may ultimately have many times more impact than any diet change that you can make. Of course, do everything that you can, including changing your diet, but keep the relative importance of everything in mind. Saving the planet begins, number 14, at gathering places, where we join together and collectively demand climate action, such as with the Sunrise Movement. As we have seen, nearly 2 out of 3 people in Copenhagen bike to work or school. This did not happen just through personal or political actions. Instead, what brought about all this was the tireless work of activists for many years. After more than a decade of this pressure, city politicians ultimately relented and began putting in the necessary infrastructure to make biking not only safe, but pleasant in the city. Without these activists, this simply would not have happened. What we need is a generation of activists to pressure politicians in the U.S. and across the globe for sweeping climate action. Saving the planet begins 15 by protesting and through acts of civil disobedience, such as Greta Thunberg's protests outside the Swedish parliament. Greta Thunberg was, just a short time ago, in many ways a pretty average high school student, though in other ways a rather extraordinary one, with the ability to see the climate crisis as a black and white issue and to sustain a laser-like focus on the problem. Still, her modest act of civil disobedience, her school strike for the climate, has ultimately changed the world. Incidentally, as Wikipedia notes, prior to her school strike, Thunberg's first action was to challenge, quote, her parents to lower the family's carbon footprint and the overall impact they had on the environment by becoming vegan, upcycling, and giving up flying. Saving the planet begins 16 with reading, as we learn more about the crisis and what is being done, as well as why not nearly enough is being done. Unfortunately, one of the things that is slowing action on the climate crisis is that it is exceptionally difficult to read through to the truth of this particular matter. Why? As we have seen, fossil fuel interests are spending many millions of dollars every year to confuse the public about the climate crisis. You know, any college-educated student deserving of the degree should be able to read through to the facts concerning an issue like the climate crisis and conclude that it represents a real, present danger to our country and planet. Indeed, any high school student should be able to have the skills necessary to do that kind of reading. Educators like myself need to make sure that we are graduating students with these skills, and everyone needs to take the time to sit down and carefully read about the climate crisis and what we can do about it. Saving the Planet begins 17 with rethinking, as we as individuals and a diverse range of human cultures take a long, hard look at how we inhabit this planet. The title of Naomi Klein's first book on the climate crisis, This Changes Everything, could easily be turned into an imperative. If we are going to successfully survive this, we need to change everything. Yes, we can hope the technology will save us. And let's be clear, technological solutions are definitely welcome. However, it is both naive and dangerous to think that technology alone will do this. Instead, we need to accept the fact that we have to make sweeping changes to how we inhabit this planet. Our mass consumerism, which seemingly has no bounds, is a case in point. Saving the Planet begins 18 by sharing what we know so that our friends too can have a better understanding of the climate crisis and what can be done. In one of the lectures on climate and generation, I noted that knowledge is not itself power. By that I meant that knowledge is only power when acted upon. Otherwise, knowledge is power squandered. This is not to say that knowledge is not important, as it clearly is the first step to power. Rash and haphazard action without knowledge can be more disastrous than not acting on knowledge. While we can each individually learn about the climate crisis, sharing this knowledge, i.e. communication, is crucial if we are to get through this. As we have seen, this not only includes communicating to people who are in denial of the crisis, but to friends and family sympathetic to the cause who sincerely want more knowledge and to know how to act on that knowledge. And as we have seen, we can effectively communicate through not just words, but through our actions. Saving the Planet begins by joining with others, this is number 19, in initiatives from local and global such as Freegan and Bicycle Collectives so that we can support each other. Yes, it would be possible, for example, to be a Freegan on your own, but as Peter Kalmus compellingly argued through his example, the support of others should be enthusiastically welcome. By this I mean not only the help of others in collecting discarded food, but the emotional support and strength that others can offer. After all, as being a Freegan may well result in your friends thinking that you are a little odd, wouldn't it be nice to have a whole group of friends, Freegan friends, who admired and were grateful for your work with this form of climate activism? Finally, Saving the Planet begins, number 20, with us, as we become, to echo a phrase often attributed to Gandhi, the change that we want to see in the world. This may sound like an odd observation coming from someone who just recorded over 30 lectures, but talk is cheap. This is, in fact, frequently brought to light by our detractors. For example, Al Gore arguably sets himself up for easy criticism by flying in personal jets. This issue is related to the idea that knowledge alone is not power. After all, if we have the knowledge that flying is an environmental disaster, yet continue to do it, then we have not only squandered that knowledge, but have arguably announced to the world, through our actions, that as far as we are concerned, it is not knowledge worth acting upon. This is a problem. And this is why people like Greta Thunberg try to live by the principles they endorse, by, for example, refusing to fly. Again, this second group of 10 things is not an exhaustive list, but it should be clear that none of the above, on either list, requires much by way of technological innovation, but rather just people both embodying change and joining together to demand it. In other words, both lists suggest personal, cultural, economic, and political changes rather than technological solutions to a crisis caused by human beings. Again, this is not to say that technological innovations are not needed to address the climate crisis, but this is not nearly enough by itself. Note that both of the above lists are aimed at the developed world. Since the poorest 3 billion people on the planet have emitted just 5% of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, only a few things on this list would even apply to them. Moreover, there is one thing that the developing world could do that would be absolutely huge if they could somehow succeed in doing it, and that is convince the developed world to stop emitting so many greenhouse gases. Well, there is one more approach that needs to be mentioned here.